The night Theodore Roosevelt decided to become unstoppable. He did not sleep that night, because sleep belonged to weaker men. Pain burned through his chest, but ambition burned brighter. In that darkness, he made a promise his body could not keep. To understand Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, we must begin before the power, before the confidence, before the legend hardened into certainty. We must return to a moment of physical collapse and private fury, because the drive that reshaped the presidency was born from fear of fragility. And that fear still shapes leadership today. In the late 19th century, Roosevelt was not the image history prefers to remember. He was sickly as a child, asthmatic, thin, and frequently bedridden. Doctors offered comfort, not solutions. Strength was something other boys inherited. For Theodore, it had to be built piece by painful piece. By the time he entered public life, that insecurity never left him. It evolved. He overworked relentlessly. He spoke forcefully. He pushed his body beyond limits others respected. Every achievement was shadowed by the same question: what if it is taken away? That question returned violently in 1898. His wife and mother died on the same day. Grief hollowed him out. He fled west, chasing danger, convinced motion could outrun sorrow. The strategy worked, but at a cost. He learned to bury pain beneath momentum. Years later, as vice president, Roosevelt was sidelined. Party leaders saw him as convenient, not dangerous, a figurehead, a way to neutralize his energy. Then the unthinkable happened: a gunshot, a dying president. And suddenly, the burden he was never meant to carry landed squarely on his shoulders. That night, Roosevelt faced the truth. He could not fight with force alone. Power had arrived whether he was ready or not. And if he hesitated, others would shape the office in his place. He did not hesitate. Instead, he chose something radical. He would not survive the presidency. He would dominate it. And from that decision, nothing about American leadership would remain the same. The decision transformed fear into momentum. Roosevelt moved before anyone could slow him down. In the days that followed, he absorbed the machinery of power with astonishing speed. Meetings stretched late into the night. Papers piled high on his desk. Where others saw continuity, Roosevelt sought motion. He believed hesitation was weakness, and weakness invited decay. The presidency, in his view, was not a referee. It was a force. If the Constitution did not forbid an action, he believed it was permitted. This was a sharp break from the past. Previous presidents had tiptoed around authority. Roosevelt charged straight through it. Trust became his first target. Massive corporations dominated railroads, oil, and steel. They shaped markets and crushed competition. Many Americans felt powerless before them. Roosevelt saw opportunity. By confronting corporate power, he could align the presidency with the public, not the elite. However, this strategy carried risk. Business leaders warned of economic collapse. Politicians accused him of authoritarian instincts. Courts pushed back. But Roosevelt pressed forward, convinced that restraint belonged to weaker eras. Behind the confidence, the old fear still pulsed. Illness struck frequently. Exhaustion followed him, yet he refused rest. Each day became a test of will. To stop meant to confront vulnerability, and vulnerability was unacceptable. Foreign policy followed the same pattern. Roosevelt expanded American presence abroad, believing strength prevented conflict. The Navy grew, influence stretched. Diplomacy carried the quiet thread of force. Peace, he believed, was preserved through readiness to act. This was the early conflict of his presidency, not between right and wrong, but between expansion and consequence, between action and overreach. Roosevelt was reshaping the office faster than the nation could fully understand, and the momentum showed no sign of slowing. Momentum soon collided with reality. Power always reveals its cost. Roosevelt's aggressive style energized a nation, but it also fractured it. Every bold move created new enemies. Corporate leaders resisted openly. Politicians accused him of eroding constitutional balance. Even allies worried he was moving too fast, reshaping institutions before the public could catch up. The presidency was no longer a steady presence. It was a constant force, pressing against limits. Roosevelt relished the fight. Conflict, to him, was proof of purpose. Yet the pressure took its toll. His health deteriorated. Pain returned. Fatigue followed him into every decision. Still, he refused to slow down. The more resistance he faced, the more convinced he became that restraint was dangerous. He expanded executive authority through interpretation, precedent, and sheer will. Each victory widened the office. Each expansion made retreat harder. The turning point came not from opponents, but from reflection. Roosevelt began to see the paradox forming. A presidency strong enough to challenge corruption was also strong enough to become corrupt itself. The same tools he used for reform could be wielded by someone with fewer scruples. This realization did not stop him. It complicated him. Roosevelt understood he was shaping something permanent, a presidency defined by action rather than permission. He accepted that future leaders would inherit the power he normalized. The conflict reached its emotional peak here. Roosevelt was no longer just fighting trusts or foreign rivals. He was wrestling with the legacy he was creating. Whether the unstoppable force he unleashed would protect democracy or one day threaten it. Yet he chose to continue, because stopping felt like surrender, and surrender, to Roosevelt, meant weakness. The presidency would never be the same, and neither would the man who reshaped it. The climax of Roosevelt's presidency was not a single act. It was acceptance. He accepted that power, once expanded, rarely returns to its original shape. He accepted that his interpretation of authority would outlive his intentions. And he accepted that leadership, when driven by force of will, always leave behind a larger shadow. Roosevelt began to speak openly about limits. Conservation became central to his vision, not just of land, but of power itself. He protected vast natural spaces, understanding that restraint, once lost, was nearly impossible to reclaim. The irony was unmistakable. The man who charged forward now argued for preservation. By the end of his time in office, the presidency had been transformed. It was no longer passive. It was no longer reactive. It was an engine of action. The public expected strength. The world expected presence. And future presidents would be judged against the standard he set. This was the resolution Roosevelt reached. He had made the office unstoppable. But unstoppable forces demanded careful hands. The danger was no longer weakness. It was excess. His story matters because it captures a turning point we still live with. The moment when leadership became performance. When action became proof. When hesitation became suspect. Roosevelt gave the nation confidence, but he also gave appetite. History remembers his energy, his courage, his certainty. It often forgets the cost of that certainty. The pressure on those who followed. The temptation to push further. To justify more, to act first and reflect later. Roosevelt believed strength saved nations. He was not entirely wrong. But strength without restraint can consume the very ideals it claims to defend. That night, he chose to be unstoppable. And the presidency has been moving ever since. Subscribe to join the journey. The night